I found the text by accident, the way most people find out their whole life is a lie, while charging my phone. It was 11 at night, for days before my wedding, and I picked up Daniel's phone instead of mine because they were the same case, same brand, same everything, because that's what happens when you've been together 6 years and your lives start blending into one blurry, comfortable thing. His phone buzzed in my hand. A text preview flashed on the lock screen. 3 words from a contact saved simply as Mom. Keep her calm. I almost put the phone down. Almost. But something in my stomach told me to tap it, and because Daniel never used a passcode, because we didn't have secrets, or so I thought, the whole message unfolded in front of me like a knife sliding out of its sheath. Keep her calm until Saturday. The rest gets wired after the ceremony. I sat there on the edge of our bed, in the apartment we picked out together, in the life I thought I understood, and I read that sentence maybe 20 times, waiting for it to mean something else. It never did. My name is Claire. I was 29 years old, 4 days from marrying a man named Daniel Hutchins, and I had just found proof that my own mother was paying him to manage me like a project with a deadline. I want to tell you this story in order, because that's the only way it makes any sense, the only way you'll understand exactly how deep this went, and exactly what happened when I stopped playing along and started digging. Because keep her calm wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came after, at 2 in the morning, 3 nights later, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a voice on the other end said, "Claire, don't sign anything on Saturday. Please." You need to hear this before it's too late. But let's start at the beginning, because you need the full picture first. I grew up in a family that looked perfect from the outside, and felt like a boardroom from the inside. My father, Richard, built a logistics company from nothing in his 20s, and by the time I was in high school, Hutchins, no wait, Whitfield, my maiden name, Whitfield Freight Solutions had 11 regional offices and a name people in our city recognized. My mother, Denise, ran the family side of things with the same precision my father ran the company. Schedules. Expectations. Appearances. Love, when it came with conditions attached, quietly, like fine print you didn't notice until you needed it. I have one sibling, my older brother Marcus, who left for California at 22 and mostly stayed gone, which in hindsight might have been the smartest decision anyone in our family ever made. When I was 22, my grandmother, my father's mother, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Eleanor who terrified everyone except me, set up a trust in my name. Not my father's. Not the company's. Mine. Eleanor didn't trust my parents with money, and she said so, more than once, at more than one holiday dinner, in that flat voice she used when she wanted everyone in the room to remember exactly what she'd said. The trust held just under $2 million, mostly from a small manufacturing patent Eleanor had held since the 70s, and it had one condition attached to it: it would fully vest to me, with no restrictions, no oversight, no committee. The day I turned 30. My 30th birthday was that Saturday. The same Saturday as my wedding. I want to be clear that I didn't plan it that way out of any strategy. Daniel and I picked the date because it was the one open Saturday at the venue we loved, 18 months out, and it happened to land 3 days after my birthday. At the time it felt like a nice coincidence. A gift wrapped inside a gift. Looking back, I think it was the single detail that made everything else possible, and the reason everything moved as fast as it did. Here's what I didn't know. Sitting there staring at Daniel's phone that night, my father's company was not 11 thriving regional offices anymore. It hadn't been for almost 2 years. A lawsuit from a former logistics partner, a bad expansion into a market that collapsed, and a credit line that had quietly ballooned into something my father could no longer service on his own. Whitfield Freight Solutions was, by that November, roughly $400,000 from a default that would have triggered a personal guarantee my father had signed years earlier, a guarantee that put our family home, and everything else in his name, on the table. My parents needed money. And my money, Eleanor's money, was sitting 3 days and 1 wedding away from being fully, legally, untouchably mine. The thing about trusts like mine is that they're airtight against outside interference, but they're not airtight against the person who holds them making bad decisions once the money is in their own hands. Once it vested to me, my parents had no legal claim to a single dollar of it. Unless, of course, I chose to give it to them. Or unless someone with influence over me chose it for me. That's where Daniel came in. I met Daniel at 23, at a mutual friend's engagement party, and for 6 years he had been, as far as I could tell, exactly what he appeared to be: kind, a little quiet, an accountant at a mid-sized firm. Someone my father liked well enough and my mother liked a little too much, which in hindsight should have been the first flag. Denise doesn't approve of things unless they serve a purpose. I used to think her approval of Daniel meant he was safe. I didn't understand until much later that it meant the opposite. After I read that text, I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that, because I think a version of me from a year earlier would have shaken him awake right then and demanded an explanation. But something cold and clear took over instead, the same instinct, I think, that Eleanor had when she built that trust in the first place. I put his phone back exactly where I found it, plugged mine in instead, and lay awake until 4 in the morning, running through 6 years of memories, looking for cracks I'd missed. I found them everywhere once I started looking. The way Daniel had gently, repeatedly, over the last 8 months, suggested we simplify the wedding finances by opening a joint account before the ceremony instead of after, just to make things easier. The way my mother had inserted herself into the seating chart, the vendor calls, even my dress fitting, with an intensity she'd never shown for anything of mine before. The way my father, a man who called me maybe once a month under normal circumstances, had started calling every few days, asking casually about how the trust paperwork was going and whether I'd thought about talking to Eleanor's old lawyer soon, just to get ahead of it. And the way, 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had come home unusually tender, unusually attentive, and told me, out of nowhere, that he thought I'd been under a lot of pressure lately and that maybe I should take it easy, maybe even consider talking to someone. A doctor, just to manage the stress before the big day. At the time I'd thought it was sweet. Now it sat in my stomach like a stone. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because this is the part of the story people always ask me about later. I did not have a breakdown. I was not unstable. I was, by every account of every person who actually knew me, a functioning, competent, reasonably calm 29-year-old woman planning a wedding. But somewhere in those weeks, a narrative had been built around me quietly, patiently, that I was fragile, overwhelmed, in need of managing. And I hadn't noticed, because the people building it were the people I trusted most. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to work, and I drove 2 hours to see Eleanor's old attorney, a sharp, retired man named Walter Grimsby, who had handled her estate for 40 years and had, technically, still handled mine since I was 22. Walter was surprised to see me. He was more surprised by what I asked him. I asked him what would happen to the trust if I were found, medically or legally, incapable of managing my own affairs on the day it vested. I watched his face change as he understood exactly why I was asking. He told me the truth, slowly, the way you tell someone something you wish you didn't have to. If a person is deemed incapacitated, through a medical evaluation, a psychiatric hold, anything that results in a court granting guardianship or conservatorship, the trust doesn't vanish. It doesn't get seized outright. But it does get placed under the control of whoever holds power of attorney or whoever the court appoints as conservator. And in most cases, Walter said, courts default first to a spouse, then to parents. I asked him what would happen if I got married on Saturday and then, shortly after, was declared incapacitated. Walter looked at me for a long moment before he answered. Then your husband would very likely be granted control of that trust before your parents ever got near it. Unless he chose to share it with them voluntarily. Or unless it was already arranged that he would. $28,000 and a text that said the rest gets wired after the ceremony. Suddenly I understood exactly what the rest meant and exactly what my parents were buying. Not a husband. A conservator. A calm, trusted, familiar face who could be in the room when a doctor asked me questions designed to make anyone sound unstable, questions about stress, about pressure, about how I'd been sleeping, how I'd been eating, whether I'd felt overwhelmed lately, whether I'd said anything concerning. A husband who would nod along. A husband who, once he had legal control of $2 million, could simply hand a manageable portion to the in-laws who'd arranged it all, and keep the rest for himself and no one, not a judge, not a doctor, not anyone, would think to question a devoted new spouse acting in his wife's best interest. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the wheel the entire 2 hours, and I didn't say a word to Daniel. I smiled at dinner. I asked him about his day. I let him tell me, again, gently, that I looked tired, that maybe I was taking on too much with the wedding, that maybe I should see someone before Saturday, just to be safe. And I nodded, and I said maybe he was right, and inside I felt something in me go very, very still and very, very focused. If they wanted calm, I would give them the calmest woman they had ever seen. Right up until the moment it mattered. Over the next 2 days, I built my own file. I am, by profession, an operations manager, which means I am extremely good at documentation, timelines, and paper trails, and I turned every one of those skills on my own family for the first time in my life. I quietly requested, under Walter's guidance, copies of every communication tied to the trust that had gone through the family lawyer's office, which, because my father was listed as a secondary contact from years earlier, included several calls he'd made in the last month asking pointed questions about incapacity clauses. I pulled bank alerts on a small joint savings account Daniel and I shared, and found the $28,000 deposit, made 11 days earlier, routed from an account with my mother's maiden name on it, an account I hadn't even known existed. I saved every text I could screenshot without him noticing, including 3 more, over those 2 days, between him and my mother, that used phrases like, "She seems good today," and "Appointment is confirmed for Monday," "Tell Richard," and once, chillingly, "Don't let her talk to Walter." That last one told me they already knew Walter was a risk, which meant I needed to move faster than they expected. Saturday was in 3 days. The wedding and my birthday and whatever appointment they had lined up for the following Monday sat on the calendar like a trap closing in slow motion. I want to tell you about the 2 a.m. call now, because I know that's the part you're waiting for, and because it's the moment everything finally cracked open completely. It came on Thursday night, 2 nights before the wedding. I was lying awake, as I had been most nights that week, when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. Claire. A woman's voice, older, careful, like she'd rehearsed this and was still scared to say it. "This is Susan. I used to work for your father at the office a long time ago. I'm sorry to call so late. I got your number from an old company directory. I hope that's all right. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you hang up, because I think you're in danger of losing something you don't even know you're about to lose." Susan had worked as my father's executive assistant for almost a decade, years earlier, before I was even in college. She'd left the company under complicated terms, she said, but she'd stayed loosely in touch with a woman who still worked in the accounting department, a woman who, 3 weeks ago, had been asked by my father to help quietly restructure some obligations tied to an incoming trust distribution. Susan's friend hadn't understood the full picture until she overheard my father on a call with someone at a private psychiatric consulting practice, discussing an evaluation scheduled for the Monday after the wedding, using my full name. Susan said her friend had panicked, hadn't known what to do, and had eventually told Susan, hoping Susan, who apparently still cared enough about the family, or about doing the right thing, would know what to do with it. Susan had spent 2 days debating whether to call me at all. She told me she was terrified of what my father would do if he found out. But she said she had a daughter my age, and she couldn't sleep knowing what she knew and saying nothing. "They set up a psychiatric consult for 2 days after your wedding," she told me. "Under your name." Your father's assistant confirmed it. I don't know exactly what they're planning, Claire, but I know it's not good, and I know it involves your husband. I sat in the dark, gripping the phone, and I told her everything I'd found: the text, the money, Walter, the trust. There was a long silence on the line. Then Susan said something I will never forget. Your grandmother knew this family better than anyone. If she built that trust the way you're describing, she built it because she saw this exact thing coming. Don't let them win, Claire. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. You are not the unstable one in this story. I didn't sleep at all after that call. I sat at my kitchen table until sunrise, and I made a decision. I was not going to cancel the wedding. I was not going to confront anyone quietly, in private, where they could control the narrative and calm me down and convince me I was overreacting, the way they'd clearly been rehearsing for weeks. I was going to let Saturday happen exactly the way they wanted it to happen, until the exact moment it stopped serving them. Friday, I called Walter and told him everything Susan had shared. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something that changed the entire shape of my plan, because the trust vested automatically at 12 a.m. On my 30th birthday, and my birthday fell on the Saturday of the wedding, there was a narrow window, technically, legally. The trust would already be fully mine, unconditionally, before the ceremony even started. My parents' entire plan depended on getting a psychiatric hold in place before I had time to act on that ownership. Which meant the incapacity evaluation on Monday wasn't really about controlling the trust before it vested. It was about controlling it immediately after, before I had any chance to move it, protect it, or spend a single dollar of it on a lawyer of my own choosing. Walter offered to file emergency documentation that Friday confirming my full mental competency and legal capacity, dated and notarized, establishing an unambiguous baseline the day before the wedding, something that would make any sudden onset psychiatric claim on Monday almost impossible to justify medically. I agreed immediately. That afternoon, I sat through a full evaluation with an independent psychiatrist Walter trusted, who found me, unsurprisingly, to be entirely lucid, competent, and stable. The report was notarized and filed by 6 p.m. Friday evening. I also asked Walter one more question before I left his office that day. I asked if there was any way to move the trust's release even earlier, not to stop it from vesting Saturday, but to make sure that the second it vested, it was already protected, already moved, already out of reach of anyone with plans for it. Walter smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office 3 days earlier and told me Eleanor had actually built in exactly that mechanism years ago, an automatic transfer instruction that, upon vesting, would move the full trust balance directly into a private account held solely in my name, at a bank with no ties whatsoever to my family or their financial advisors. Eleanor, it turned out, had thought of almost everything. Saturday morning, I got ready for my wedding the way any bride would. My mother fussed over my hair. My father told me, with what I now understood was calculated warmth, how proud Eleanor would have been. Daniel texted me a photo of himself in his suit with 3 heart emojis, and I looked at that message for a long time before I set the phone down and let my bridesmaids finish my makeup. At 11:58 that night, because we'd chosen, almost by accident, an evening ceremony that ran long with photos and toasts, meaning the reception was still going strong as midnight approached, I stood near the edge of the dance floor with my phone in my clutch. And I watched the clock. At 12 a.m., the trust vested. Walter had confirmed it would trigger automatically. Within minutes, according to the notification I received quietly, discreetly, on my phone, the funds had already moved into the new account. Untouched by anyone. Unshared with anyone. Fully, finally mine. I found Daniel by the bar a few minutes later, glowing, congratulating himself, probably already imagining Monday. I found my parents shortly after that, standing together near the head table, deep in a quiet conversation that stopped the moment they saw my face. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because I know you're picturing a scene, and there was one, but it wasn't the one anyone expected. I asked Daniel, calmly, in front of my parents, whether he remembered a text he'd received 11 days earlier that said, "Keep her calm until Saturday," The rest gets wired after the ceremony. I watched every ounce of color leave his face. I asked my father, calmly, whether he remembered a phone call to a psychiatric consulting practice scheduling an evaluation for Monday, under my name, without my knowledge. I asked my mother, calmly, whether an account under her maiden name had wired $28,000 to my now-husband 11 days before our wedding. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The silence answered for them, in front of roughly 40 guests who had gone very, very quiet. I told them, still calm, still steady, that the trust had already vested and already moved, hours ago, to an account none of them had access to, and that Walter Grimsby had a full, notarized file documenting every text, every deposit, every phone call, and a competency evaluation dated the day before the wedding that would make any future claim of incapacity legally indefensible. I told them that Susan sent her regards. I watched my mother's face when I said that name, and I understood, finally, completely, that every part of this had been real. I filed for an annulment the following week, on grounds of fraud, using the $28,000 payment and the surrounding text messages as evidence. Daniel didn't fight it. I think some small part of him understood, once it was over, that he'd been as used by my parents as I had, just willing, in a way I never was. I haven't spoken to him since. My relationship with my parents ended that night, cleanly, in front of witnesses, in a way that left no room for the quiet, gradual reconciliation they no doubt expected once the shock wore off. It's been 8 months. I built a life with what Eleanor left me, and with a version of myself I don't think I ever would have found if I hadn't picked up a phone that wasn't mine on an ordinary Tuesday night and read 3 words I was never supposed to see. I think about Eleanor a lot these days. About how she must have watched my parents for years, quietly, patiently, and built a trust designed not just to give me money, but to give me a way out, if I ever needed one. I think about Susan too, a woman who owed me nothing, who risked everything she still had with my family to make one phone call at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep with what she knew. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this story to take with them, it's this: the people who claim to be keeping you calm are not always keeping you safe. Sometimes calm is just the word they use for controlled. And sometimes the only way out is to let them believe it's working, right up until the moment it stops.